According to our confidential sources within several regional administrations, what is unfolding in Crimea cannot be dismissed as a simple logistical failure. It feels deliberate, controlled, calculated. The peninsula, long accustomed to uncertainty, is now facing something it has never experienced before: silence at the gas stations. Pumps sealed, nozzles locked, queues dissolving into disbelief. Entire regions stand still, engines cold, roads empty. It is as if the pulse of daily life has been switched off with one motion, and nobody dares to admit who pressed the button. For weeks, the official statements spoke of temporary disruptions and scheduled maintenance. The same sterile phrasing that always precedes a crisis too vast to contain. Yet, beneath that bureaucratic calm, insiders describe chaos. Fuel depots closed without warning, convoys rerouted at night, security cordons appearing around terminals where only civilians used to work. The word shutdown is no longer whispered in private. It is being pronounced out loud, though never in front of the cameras. And the moment it was said publicly, the air on the peninsula changed. In expert circles, the event is already being referred to as the first energy quarantine, a sudden disconnection of an entire region from its vital arteries, not because of an explosion or a blockade, but because of something far more subtle: the silent withdrawal of supply. One by one, the tankers stopped arriving. The reserves that were supposed to last weeks vanished overnight. And now, the peninsula has entered a phase that specialists describe as economically oxygenless. Our interlocutors in the energy sector admit this was not a spontaneous failure. The sequence is too synchronized, too precise. The disappearance of fuel coincides with unusual movements of state cargoes, with abrupt reassignments of officials, with strange patterns in digital surveillance. Someone, somewhere, had been preparing this for months. They call it technical realignment. In the language of insiders, that means only one thing: control has shifted. And when control shifts, energy becomes the first weapon. For the inhabitants, the change is physical. Morning commutes that once formed a steady flow of engines are replaced by an eerie stillness. Public transport runs sporadically. Emergency services move with escorts. The smell of gasoline, once the scent of normality, has disappeared from the air. It feels like a blackout of movement itself. According to restricted analytical briefings circulating among economic advisors, this shutdown may have been a test, a controlled simulation of isolation. To observe what happens when a region is left to depend solely on itself, how long it takes before supply chains fracture, before trust evaporates, before fear becomes tangible. The logic is cynical, but familiar. Every system is tested through deprivation. And what better way to measure loyalty than by taking away the one thing people can't live without: mobility. People stand in silent lines, hoping for rumors to materialize into fuel deliveries. Truck drivers sleep beside empty tanks. Farmers abandon machinery in the fields. Those who still have a few liters left treat it like currency, measured, hidden, protected. In some districts, gasoline is now traded by the liter, exchanged for food, for medicine, even for favors. Economists call it an informal adaptation mechanism. Psychologists call it the return of primitive trust. Meanwhile, the official narrative remains frozen. No one takes responsibility, and every explanation sounds like a copy of the one before it. Technical glitch, temporary malfunction, scheduled recalibration. Each phrase carefully designed to say nothing. And yet, the silence between those words grows louder every day. In bureaucratic language, silence is not absence. It's strategy. Closed-source data obtained from fuel monitoring systems show that the depletion began far earlier than publicly acknowledged. The reserves that were supposedly intact were already drained weeks before the first queues appeared. Internal communications suggest that the command to restrict shipments came from outside the peninsula. That means the shutdown is not an accident, it's a message, and the message is simple. Control is no longer invisible, it's absolute. Experts who have analyzed similar crises describe the current moment as a controlled vacuum, a point at which the absence of energy becomes an instrument of order. Every liter of fuel now passes through approval channels. Every movement is logged. The system functions, but only within parameters defined from above. That's why many in the energy sector quietly refer to the situation not as a collapse, but as a demonstration of how fast a region can be immobilized without a single shot fired. The psychological atmosphere on the ground reflects this new reality. Fear no longer manifests as panic. It manifests as stillness. Streets are not crowded. They are empty. People don't shout. They whisper. The uncertainty is too structured to feel accidental. It has the rhythm of a plan. The energy system has been reduced to a single pulse, beating somewhere in the administrative core, beyond public sight. And that pulse decides who moves and who stops. In private conversations, logisticians describe the sensation as living inside a paused film. Everything appears normal, until you notice that nothing is actually moving. The infrastructure remains intact. The technology still works, but the fuel, the blood of the system, has been withdrawn. A silent sanction. A form of internal quarantine that isolates not by walls, but by stillness. According to several economic analysts familiar with classified reports, the long-term implications are far more complex than simple shortage. What is being tested here is compliance, how societies respond when the invisible infrastructure of life vanishes overnight. The peninsula has become a laboratory of dependency. Every hour without fuel reveals the limits of endurance, the thresholds of frustration, and the mechanics of silence. Because silence, as insiders often remind us, is the most efficient form of control. Those who have access to internal networks confirm that communications are being filtered. Keywords related to the shutdown are systematically suppressed. Local media are instructed to emphasize temporary logistics realignments and positive recovery dynamics. But even propaganda has limits when the streets are empty. And that's what makes the situation so volatile. Not the absence of energy, but the absence of truth. The sense of isolation deepens. There is no way to leave. Ferries are suspended. Roads are blocked. The only routes open are digital, and even they are narrowing. For many, the shutdown feels like a metaphor that has suddenly become real. The world is closing in, 1 liter at a time, and behind every official reassurance lies the quiet knowledge that this might not end soon. In closed rooms, specialists describe what's coming next. Rationing, redistribution, the birth of parallel economies. But for now, there is only waiting. Waiting for the pumps to breathe again, for the engines to start, for the illusion of normality to return. And as the hours pass, it becomes increasingly clear that what began as a technical malfunction has turned into a psychological event, a collective pause that no one dares to break. They call it a shortage, but in truth, it feels like a signal. Something larger is being calibrated behind the scenes, and until that process is complete, Crimea will remain suspended, between silence and revelation, between dependency and defiance, between the hum of engines that no longer start and the murmur of a population that no longer believes. And that is only the beginning. Stay with us. Stories like this rarely reach the surface. Subscribe, because the next wave of information may not be public for long. In the days following the first signs of the shutdown, the peninsula began to resemble a map without movement. The once familiar rhythm of traffic lights changing for no one, the sound of idling engines replaced by the rustle of wind across empty streets. All of it felt unreal, as though the region had been cut from the rest of the country and sealed beneath a transparent dome. The silence became its own kind of noise, vibrating in the background of every conversation, every unspoken thought. Officials still appeared on television, smiling in front of screens that displayed maps and charts. They spoke of redistribution efforts and stabilization in progress, but their words lacked substance. The footage was the same everywhere. Static shots, delayed broadcasts, no live reports. For those who knew how information systems operate, it was clear. The delay wasn't a glitch. It was censorship disguised as technical difficulty. Someone was rewriting the story in real time. By the end of the first week, the peninsula's industrial sectors began to stall. Construction halted, agricultural operations froze, fishing fleets stayed in ports, engines rusting in silence. Entire neighborhoods went dark, not because of electricity shortages, but because the fuel that powered their backup systems had been confiscated. Gasoline, diesel, kerosene, everything was being redirected to critical infrastructure, a phrase so ambiguous that it could justify anything. Hospitals and security forces remained active, but even they started rationing their movements. Those who could access restricted economic bulletins noticed a pattern. The flow of fuel from mainland depots didn't stop entirely. It was simply rerouted. What had been a public commodity became a private asset. Convoys moved at night, unmarked and silent, escorted by vehicles without license plates. Their routes avoided main roads and satellite coverage. Insiders whispered that certain high-ranking networks were stockpiling reserves under government protection, not for public distribution, but for strategic use. This wasn't chaos, it was orchestration, a choreography of absence designed to appear accidental. In the administrative heart of the peninsula, mid-level officials began receiving coded directives. Prioritize stabilization of sentiment. That was the euphemism for containment, preventing unrest before it formed. Every public statement was cleared through a new layer of oversight, every statistic adjusted to reflect manageable dynamics. Even the language changed. There were no shortages, only imbalances. No shutdown, only temporary recalibration. Words were being rearranged to mask reality, to soften the perception of what had already become irreversible. People understood instinctively that something larger was happening, though no one could articulate it. Conversations grew quieter, and the simplest acts, starting a generator, filling a canister, idling a car, became acts of defiance. The air carried the taste of suspicion. Who still had access to fuel? Who was responsible for this paralysis? Why did certain government convoys still move freely when everyone else was told to wait? Rumors multiplied faster than any official update. Some claimed sabotage, others spoke of foreign interference. A few whispered of a deliberate internal test, a stress experiment ordered from above to measure the resilience of a captive population. Whether true or not, these whispers became truth by repetition. In a system built on secrecy, belief always replaces evidence. In confidential briefings reviewed by our contacts, analysts used an unsettling phrase, managed scarcity. It describes a state where deprivation isn't accidental, it's engineered to shape behavior. When people are denied access to what sustains them, they adapt not through rebellion, but through compliance. The first reaction is anger. The second is fear. The third is silence. Once silence settles, control becomes effortless. Across the peninsula, the transformation was visible even without words. Cafes closed, not because of lack of customers, but because deliveries stopped. Schools shortened hours. Public transport reduced routes. Each cancellation, each pause, created a void, and that void filled with speculation. The population wasn't told the truth, but it didn't matter. They could feel it in the air. The peninsula was being rewired, both physically and psychologically. Satellite imagery obtained by independent analysts confirmed unusual activity at several key energy terminals. Fuel containers once aligned for export were now positioned inland, shielded from view. Helicopters landed without flight plans. Surveillance patterns showed lights remaining on in administrative compounds long after curfews began. Whatever was being decided there, it wasn't recovery. It was management. Crisis management in its most literal form. Insiders from the transportation sector described their new reality as blind operation. Routes were reassigned without coordinates, only through voice instructions. Drivers no longer received written manifests. Everything verbal, everything temporary. It was as if the system wanted to erase its own footprints, leaving no paper trail, no accountability. "You don't document experiments," one of them said quietly. "You observe them." And while the peninsula watched, disconnected from the mainland narrative, a secondary story began to unfold. Financial institutions quietly imposed transaction limits. Mobile networks slowed. Digital payments were redirected through alternative servers. Experts recognized this immediately. A soft lockdown. Not only fuel, but data was being filtered. A double isolation, physical and digital. The peninsula was becoming not just still, but mute. That is when fear transformed into something colder. Realization. The shutdown wasn't temporary. It was systemic. The logistics of modern life, energy, money, movement, were being switched off, one layer at a time, replaced by a centralized structure that answered to no one visible. The region had entered a new phase of existence, suspended animation under administrative control. Within local administrations, tension rose. Officials began communicating through intermediaries, unwilling to leave digital traces. Some tried to warn their families to store essentials, but even private messages started disappearing before they were read. Information blackout had become complete. No panic, no uprising, just quiet submission. A society without fuel, without connection, without movement. And in that stillness, something unsettling emerged. Adaptation. People adjusted to immobility. Streets that once pulsed with traffic became paths for bicycles and carts. Workplaces reorganized schedules around daylight. Markets revived ancient barter habits. It was survival, but it was also conditioning. A test of endurance disguised as necessity. According to restricted intelligence summaries, the experiment was yielding results faster than expected. Public trust declined, but not explosively. It dissolved quietly. The population was learning to accept uncertainty as normal, deprivation as routine. Control had never been easier. Energy specialists describe the effect in mathematical terms. Controlled entropy. When chaos is confined within defined boundaries, it doesn't destroy the system, it reinforces it. The peninsula had become a model for a new kind of governance, one that doesn't rule through abundance but through selective deprivation, a quiet calibration of obedience. And yet, beneath that structure, small fractures began to appear. Whispers of local resistance, fuel stolen from convoys, black market traders emerging overnight, coded radio transmissions from coastal districts. These were not revolts. They were instincts. The first tremors of a population remembering its agency. And though tiny, they worried those in power, because no experiment survives once its subjects start to question its purpose. Tonight, as the peninsula lies under the hum of generators that barely breathe, one truth echoes through the silence. This isn't just a shortage, it's a rehearsal for a future where scarcity becomes policy, where stillness becomes order, where dependence becomes loyalty. The shadow over Crimea is not the absence of light, it is the presence of control. And what happens next will determine whether this was merely an isolated blackout, or the prototype of a much larger system waiting to spread beyond the peninsula's borders. The silence is deepening, and somewhere within that silence, someone is still watching, measuring, recording, learning how far obedience can stretch before it breaks. By the third week, silence had acquired weight. It pressed on the air, thick and tangible, like humidity before a storm. The peninsula no longer sounded human. The mechanical rhythm of engines, generators, refineries, the background noise of civilization, had vanished. Even the sea, once the only reliable escape from landlocked anxiety, lay unnaturally still. In this quiet, people began to hear themselves think, and that was the most dangerous sound of all. Gas stations stood as monuments to a vanished normality. Their neon signs glowed faintly through dust, flickering above empty lots that now served as gathering places for those who refused to believe that movement could simply end. The pumps were taped shut, sealed by red ribbons marked maintenance, but everyone knew there was nothing left to maintain. The silence of the machines was a message, one that said more clearly than any broadcast: the flow has stopped, and it will not return soon. In small towns, the shutdown became personal. Families who had built their lives around mobility, truckers, taxi drivers, delivery workers, found themselves staring at idle vehicles like at gravestones. They cleaned them, polished them, waited beside them, as if loyalty could bring the engines back to life. When nothing changed, they stopped waiting. Hope, like fuel, evaporated quietly. Our sources inside regional energy committees describe a bureaucratic paralysis that borders on absurdity. Memos circulate daily, filled with reassurances about upcoming stabilizations. Yet no one in those offices has seen a tanker in over 2 weeks. Local administrators are instructed to manage expectations, a phrase that has become synonymous with lying. Tell them to stay calm, one directive said bluntly. The narrative must remain optimistic. But optimism, when spoken into empty air, becomes mockery. The peninsula's silence is deceptive. Beneath the surface, black markets have bloomed like mold in a sealed room. At night, faint lights flicker in abandoned garages where old barrels are drained, filtered, sold by the liter. The price of fuel is no longer measured in currency. It's measured in trust. You trade with people you know, or you risk everything. Even whispers have value now. Someone saw a convoy near the western ridge. Someone found diesel hidden in a fishing port. These phrases travel faster than official bulletins. They form the new bloodstream of communication. Insiders from logistics sectors call it the gray economy of survival. It thrives in every vacuum, and the deeper the silence, the more it grows. But it also carries a paradox. The very networks that help people survive are the ones being watched most closely. Security agencies infiltrate informal fuel rings, posing as traders, as mechanics, as friends. Every exchange risks exposure. Every rumor could be bait. The fear is not just of running out of fuel, it's of speaking to the wrong person about it. Experts who have studied other controlled shortages point out the psychological symmetry at play. At first, people beg for information. Then, they stop asking, fearing that questions draw attention. Finally, they internalize the logic of silence. They start censoring themselves. The peninsula is entering that third stage. Conversations at markets pause when unknown faces appear. Neighbors nod, but no longer linger. Everyone has learned the same unspoken lesson. In a vacuum, words are as dangerous as shortages. In official broadcasts, a new kind of language has emerged. It sounds optimistic, but feels hollow. Logistics corridors are being recalibrated. Strategic stocks are under redistribution. The situation remains under control. Each phrase follows the same rhythm: calm, passive, indefinite. Not lies, but carefully structured absences of truth. Behind these sterile reassurances, the administration continues to shift assets, reroute convoys, and suppress information leaks. The population is told to endure. The unspoken message: endurance is obedience. Energy analysts observing the shutdown from afar describe it as a silent coup of logistics. Control has migrated from political structures to supply chains. Whoever holds the last liter of fuel holds the last word. And so, governance has changed its shape, from decrees to distribution. The state no longer needs to command, it only needs to withhold. Meanwhile, the social fabric begins to fray. Public transport collapses first, then schools, then hospitals struggling to run ambulances. Life shrinks inward. Streets that once echoed with the sound of traffic now echo with footsteps. Bicycles multiply, not as symbols of resilience, but of regression. Even electricity feels less certain, though technically it hasn't failed. Fear alters perception. People start to expect darkness even before it arrives. By mid-month, psychological fatigue sets in. Families ration not only food and water, but also emotion. There is no room for anger anymore, only exhaustion. People conserve energy in every form. It becomes a way of life, an unspoken adaptation to scarcity. Sociologists refer to this as collective dissociation, the moment when a society stops reacting and starts surviving on autopilot. In that state, propaganda finds perfect soil. If people are too tired to hope, they will believe whatever promises rest. Confidential reports from regional authorities warn of an emerging behavioral drift. Theft is increasing, but so is cooperation. Communities without fuel have begun forming collective patrols, guarding what's left of local resources. There's no law, just mutual dependence. The paradox of crisis is that it destroys trust in institutions, but forces trust among individuals. Each town becomes a miniature republic, governed not by ideology, but by need. And still, the official silence continues. The mainland media has reduced coverage to a few carefully worded updates, presenting the situation as a temporary disruption of logistics chains. Experts are prohibited from commenting publicly. Even those who try to speak anonymously find their statements removed within hours. The information landscape has become as barren as the fuel stations themselves. Every deleted article, every censored report becomes another marker of the invisible perimeter that now defines the peninsula. In private, analysts admit that the crisis is no longer about fuel. It's about obedience. A society deprived of motion becomes easier to monitor, easier to predict. When no one moves, nothing unexpected happens. That is the beauty of immobilization from a control perspective. It removes uncertainty. Stillness becomes stability. Stability becomes policy. Yet, somewhere within that stillness, a quiet defiance grows. It doesn't roar or march. It waits. You can feel it in the way people glance at each other at markets, in the coded gestures of exchange, in the silent solidarity of shared absence. The population has learned to communicate without words, to organize without signals, to endure without instruction. What was meant as paralysis may soon evolve into something else: memory, perhaps even resistance. For now, though, the peninsula remains locked in its own reflection, a mirror showing what happens when motion ceases but life continues. Every empty gas station is a monument to that contradiction. The machines of progress standing still while human will silently adapt around them. No one knows when the first tanker will arrive again, or whether it will arrive at all. But one thing is clear. After weeks of silence, people have stopped waiting for permission to move. They are learning that stillness, too, can be a weapon. These are the stories that rarely reach the surface, the stories buried under layers of official calm and deliberate silence. Subscribe now, not for the news they allow you to hear, but for the truth they try to erase. By the time the fourth month of the shutdown arrived, Crimea no longer looked like a region. It looked like a simulation. The rhythm of daily life had been rewritten by absence. Roads were clear, machines intact, people alive, yet everything felt paused, as if someone had pressed a single invisible key and held it down. The silence was complete, but not empty. It was full of meaning, structured, intentional. Experts from restricted analytical groups called it the most efficient system failure ever recorded. But those who lived inside it understood the truth. It wasn't a failure. It was a demonstration. Inside closed offices, administrative reports used the term selective restoration. It sounded clinical, harmless, but in bureaucratic language, it meant control through scarcity. Fuel began to reappear in precise, calculated doses, just enough to restart essential operations, never enough to restore independence. Deliveries were timed, measured, and monitored. Entire neighborhoods received allocations based on their perceived reliability. Data replaced democracy. Obedience became the new logistics. Our sources within local distribution agencies confirmed what few dared to say aloud. The flow of energy was now a tool of governance. The state no longer ruled through policy, it ruled through movement. Whoever decided which engines could start, decided which lives could continue, and that realization changed everything. At night, convoys moved under the cover of silence. Their headlights were dimmed, their cargo unmarked. Every route was unpredictable, every driver monitored. Fuel, once the lifeblood of the region, had become contraband even in its official form. Meanwhile, people built parallel systems of survival, hidden depots, whispered trade, small boats carrying barrels along unlit coasts. Smugglers became providers, citizens became traders. What the authorities called chaos, the people called adaptation. Economists observing from afar described it as an unintentional decentralization. The shutdown had fractured the hierarchy of dependence. Each village, each community, learned to function on its own. Not efficiently, not comfortably, but independently. It was the quiet birth of something dangerous: autonomy. In systems built on control, autonomy is always seen as rebellion. And so the state responded with its oldest weapon: information. Official broadcasts returned, calm and rehearsed. Anchors smiled, charts glowed, words like stability, progress, and renewal repeated endlessly. Yet the faces on the screen looked detached, their eyes unfocused, as if reading lines from a different world. People watched without listening. They had learned to hear what was not being said, the hesitation between sentences, the pauses where truth used to live. Propaganda had become a lullaby for those too tired to care, and a code for those who still remembered. In the meantime, hidden documents circulated among insiders, fragments of internal research titled Resilience Metrics of Controlled Populations. They spoke of Crimea not as a tragedy, but as a model, a proof of concept. The data was stunning. Social unrest minimal, compliance high, operational control total. The conclusion was clear: deprivation worked better than intimidation. Fear, if managed quietly, produced stability without resistance. This was not about fuel anymore. It was about method. The experiment had succeeded. When the first tankers finally returned, escorted by armed vehicles and silent men in dark uniforms, there were no crowds, no applause. The peninsula watched in stillness. People didn't cheer. They observed. The smell of gasoline filled the air again, heavy and unreal. Engines started, buses rolled, factories hummed. But beneath that mechanical revival, the silence persisted. Something essential had been severed: trust. The population moved again, but only because it had been told to. Freedom of movement had become permission to move. Officials declared victory. Stability restored, they announced. But stability had a new definition: predictability without freedom. Every gas station now watched through surveillance lenses, every liter purchased, every engine started, every route driven, all logged, analyzed, archived. The shutdown had ended, but its echo had become infrastructure. Control was no longer visible. It was embedded in every system that had been restored. In private, analysts whispered that the reserves had never truly run out. The shortage was artificial, a controlled simulation, a test of endurance. It proved that entire populations could be immobilized not by war, not by destruction, but by silence. And once that silence had been mastered, it could be replicated anywhere. Crimea was not a crisis. It was a prototype. Yet something unforeseen grew in the cracks of that control: awareness. The people who had lived through the stillness no longer believed in permanence. They had seen how quickly comfort could vanish, how silence could replace truth, how stability could become captivity. They had endured, and endurance changed them. They no longer waited for salvation. They prepared for repetition. In every full tank, they saw a countdown. In every engine's hum, a memory of when motion stopped. Sociologists now describe the peninsula as a post-event society, a population that survived a systemic failure and understood its own expendability. That awareness is quiet, but it spreads. You can feel it in the way people talk, cautiously yet precisely, in how they store supplies without being told, in how they no longer trust the light to stay on. The experiment created control, yes, but it also created immunity, not against deprivation, but against illusion. In closed reports, the architects of the system acknowledge the risk. Behavioral drift detected, one document reads. Population remains compliant but ideologically detached. That detachment is lethal to control. When people stop believing, fear loses its edge. The shutdown success had a flaw. It taught survival, and survival once learned cannot be unlearned. Months after the return of fuel, Crimea appears calm, functional, stable. The perfect image of recovery. But those who know how to listen recognize another sound beneath the engines, the quiet murmur of vigilance. The population has become watchful. They move with purpose. They speak in low tones, and when the official bulletins say, everything is fine, they simply nod. They no longer argue, they remember. Memory has become their weapon. It circulates silently, stronger than fuel, more dangerous than unrest. It is what remains when systems fail and restart. The one thing no government can ration. The shutdown was meant to erase trust. Instead, it replaced it with clarity. People learned to read reality without mediation, to detect lies by their temperature, to find truth in the rhythm of silence. And that truth is simple, devastating, irreversible. Control depends on obedience, but obedience depends on illusion. The moment illusion dies, control begins to crack. Now, as officials present the shutdown as a historical anomaly, the real story spreads quietly through markets, through corridors, through whispers. Everyone knows what happened. Everyone knows it can happen again. The peninsula lives in a fragile equilibrium, not peace, not crisis, but anticipation. Experts call it latent volatility. Insiders call it the waiting phase. Because systems built on silence always repeat themselves. They test their limits again and again until silence finally answers back. And when it does, the world will remember Crimea. Not as a territory, but as a warning. A place where movement was stolen to measure obedience, and where silence became a mirror reflecting the architecture of control. The shutdown was never about fuel. It was about the future, a future that now waits quietly, disguised as normal life. Engines roar again, lights shine, buses run. But beneath the hum of returning order, the air still holds the scent of fear. It is faint, almost gone, yet unforgettable. The peninsula has resumed motion, but it no longer believes in direction. It moves because it must, not because it trusts. This is not recovery. It is repetition. Stay with us, because silence has a pattern, and patterns always return. Subscribe now before the next one begins.